So Dr. Uhlig is a senior medical director at Carix Biopharmaceuticals and an adjunct associate professor at Tufts University. As the clinical development lead at Carix, she provides strategic medical direction for phase 3 and 4 clinical trials in adults and children with chronic kidney disease. Welcome.
Thank you. So I will be reporting to you on the progress of the work group to overcome barriers to drug development in children with chronic kidney disease. And again, I'm working as a senior medical director at Carix Biopharmaceuticals, and I'm involved with the pediatric plans for our drug, actually 2 pediatric plans, and I'm also the co-chair for the work group. So, So many medicines lack information on their use in children. And over the last 2 decades, the FDA and the EMA have enacted laws to require and incentivize the study of drugs in children, with the goal to develop safe and effective drugs for children. And what that entails for a sponsor, usually along the way to approval for a drug in adults, is that at some point they engage in a dialogue with the regulators to outline the specifications for a study in children. That will be a pediatric requirement. And again, the regulators have a stick, which is a requirement, or they also have a carrot in which if you fulfill their requirement, you may get extra exclusivity on your drug. And in the process of doing so, the sponsors will engage usually with academic nephrologists, pediatric nephrologists who are, understand the disease, who can inform them about the clinical need, who can inform them about successes and failures in this space with a similar drug or similar indication. They will try to query databases of registries or prior trials to vet the eligibility criteria, to understand the barriers to enrollment, the feasibility of certain criteria, and they will work with contract research organizations to conduct feasibility and then ultimately contract with them for the execution of the study. And they will try to leverage that kind of information in their negotiations with the regulators to come up with, possibly waivers for certain age groups due to toxicology concerns or due to lack of numbers, lack of, epidemiological concerns for certain age groups. And all of that information will inherently be considered to be suspect or biased by the regulators in that negotiation. So the problem is that despite the regulations that aim to spur drug development in children, the progress in pediatric drugs and devices still lags behind because inherently conducting research in children is challenging. There are ethical issues, there are feasibility issues, there are drug development issues, formulation issues. And specifically for children with chronic kidney disease, we're really dealing with a small population that's dispersed geographically. And now, as a result of the regulations that we have for pediatric requirements, there's actually a number of studies that are actively competing for this small number of children at a limited number of sites that are able to conduct the research. And as an unintended consequence of these regulations, there is this active competition that may jeopardize the successful completion of any one of these studies. On the bottom, you can see the numbers from USRDS on children on prevalent dialysis in 2014. So we're dealing with 1,400 kids, most of them, or half of them, more than half of them, over the age of 12. The other half, 700 or so, are spread out over the younger age groups. And there's probably about the same number in Europe. And then when it comes to children not yet on dialysis, our estimates are very uncertain. It may be in the same ballpark. So, altogether, non-dialysis and dialysis, maybe 2,000 to 3,000 kids in each of the geographic areas. And when you look at clinicaltrials.gov and you look for industry-sponsored studies in children with chronic kidney disease, there's a graveyard of studies that had to be terminated early due to enrollment issues. So that's the problem. So this work group was created to address an unmet need of coordination of drug studies in children with chronic kidney disease to optimize their success, to manage the limited resources in the best possible way, and to facilitate the completion of regulatory requirements. And the methods used are those of consensus-based recommendations with multi-stakeholder input, as well as we have an aspirational goal of generating a standing entity of a quote-unquote clearinghouse. And I'll talk more about that idea. And ultimately, the goal is to facilitate harmonization of regulatory requirements across regulators in different regions, because it's not unusual that the regulatory requirements for pediatric plans that you're handed down from the regulators in Europe or in the US are not necessarily 100% congruent in terms of the numbers of patients, the numbers of children in each age group, whether or not you need a control group, what your control group should be, and the duration of the study, for example. So here you can see the composition of the work group, and I think ours was the first one that attempted to have not only representation from the FDA, but we worked very hard to also have representation from the EMA due to the issue that I described to you. Because of the limited number of patients in each of these areas, it's really not possible for a sponsor to be able to do 2 different studies in 2 different areas. So you really need to align the requirements to be able to conduct one study across the regions. There are the representatives from industry. There is representation from academic nephrology. We have Pamela Duquette as our representative for the Key Patient Family Partnership Council. We have other consultants because we wanted to learn from other areas, including oncology. We have a pharmacist, and we have a CMS liaison, as well as our trusted key support people. So the work group came up with 5 project aims. The first 2 deal with recognizing the legal remit and regulatory framework, which is the underlying foundation that drives drug development. And to understand what avenues of communication there already are between the regulators, because what we heard from our industry representatives in the work group, that they struggle when they try to align the regulatory requirements across the geographic areas. But there are indeed avenues of communication that the regulators use. Nevertheless, we felt that another goal should be to seek further avenues for harmonization of study designs across regions. And the 5th goal, I'm jumping ahead and then coming back to 3 and 4, really deals with identifying mechanisms to assess key risks and benefits. And Pamela has developed a survey that is waiting to be piloted in a larger group of patients and providers to survey their attitudes towards conducting research in children with chronic kidney disease. Goals 3 and 4 are both the most low-hanging and the most aspirational goals of our work group. The most aspirational being to develop methods to prioritize drugs and drug classes for pediatric CKD clinical trials. And I would consider the most low-hanging to optimize the planning and conduct of these studies in children with CKD. So let me talk a little bit about what the work group is planning to do to address aims 3 and 4. And just for aims 1 and 2, the output of the work group will be hopefully a white paper that's co-authored with our regulatory colleagues. So again, this is the status quo. You have that bidirectional communication between the industry sponsors and the regulators. And again, there is these narrower arrows for their communication between the regulators and this orchestration of supporting information that comes from, company-sought consultants. And the goal really is to shift that to develop an entity that's independent, that could be a quote-unquote clearinghouse or a trusted broker that will provide the support services for the sponsors and will maybe help them to do more like one-stop shopping rather than having to dig out and find out the right people for the right questions. But it will always also provide an umbrella for constituencies, for consultants, pediatric nephrology, pharmacology, toxicology, for patients and for families, for trial networks, for databases of trials and registries, and it will provide capabilities for feasibility assessments and other stakeholders. And it will provide an avenue not only to provide, the responses on request, but to build institutional memory so that not every time you start from scratch when a new pediatric commitment in nephrology comes down the pike. And ideally, this entity would then develop not only to respond to the pediatric requirements that come from the regulators to the sponsor, but it would also come up to develop a list of prioritization, of priorities based on the real unmet needs in the community. and hopefully it would provide outputs that could then serve to inform the agenda for the regulators. So the deliverables of this entity would be to serve as a contact for interested stakeholders, to connect developers with trialists and sources of data and subjects, to identify expertise for consultation, to provide accurate estimates of available patient populations. What we currently have is shotgun approaches to feasibility where you may be under or overcounting the number of available patients. The goals are to identify and encourage also novel approaches to optimize the conduct of pediatric trials, maybe to pool control groups, to facilitate needs assessments and prioritization, and to coordinate among the various groups that are already working towards these goals. The original work group went on to form an implementation committee that is tasked with developing this entity. It contains some of the original members as well as 2 new members that were identified by IPNA, by the International Pediatric Nephrology Association, again, to consider it as an international effort. And so far, they have developed a working charter proposal. They have disseminated it to multiple stakeholders. You can see here the alphabet soup of the who's who in pediatric nephrology. And they're working to identify stakeholders and areas of expertise. They're planning to disseminate information about these plans in webinars, presentations, and abstracts. They still have a fair amount of work to do to actually work through the detail of their plans for operations. How are they going to open for business when the sponsor wants to come and put in a query, and how are they going to triage these requests? How are they going to document it? How are they going to deal with confidentiality? What is the business model? Is there going to be a charge? And the goal is to sort of open up for business later this year, to have trial runs with sponsor requests, and then to analyze how it works, to be able to then inform a final standing entity that was still looking for a home and a measure of support, and to hopefully unveil this at a symposium in 2019 at the ASPN. So with that, I would like to invite you to give us your feedback, to tell us of other efforts that may already be going on in pediatric nephrology, to pool the resources, to give us your honest feedback, to give us your brilliant ideas of who should be housing this entity, how to make it successful. And then I'd like to close with coming back to Melissa's question that for me, having been able to serve on this has amply rewarded me and has been very insightful to actually do my day job as well. So thank you, and I'm happy to take your comments and questions.